Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Founder Hour podcast.
And this podcast is brought to you by Outer. Outer makes the world's most beautiful, comfortable, innovative, and high-quality outdoor furniture, all from sustainable materials, and is the only outdoor furniture with a patented built-in cover to make protecting it effortless. From teak chairs to fire pit tables, everything Outer makes has the look and feel of what you'd expect at a five-star resort for less than you'd pay at a big box store for something that won't last.
Pat, and you know how much I love five-star resorts.
Oh yeah, I do.
And as you know, Pat and I spend a lot of time outdoors, and we love hanging out on our outer couches. We're certain you'll love it too. For a limited time, get 10% off and free shipping at liveouter.com. This is Outer's best offer anywhere.
Anywhere.
Only available to the Founder Hour listeners. Get 10% off and free shipping at live, O-U-T-E-R. Let me say that again for all you alphabet geeks. Live, OUTER.com/the Founder Hour. That's liveouter.com/the Founder Hour. Terms and conditions apply.
Let's get into the episode. Our guest today is Steve Case. Steve is one of America's best known and most accomplished entrepreneurs and a pioneer in making the internet part of everyday life. Steve's entrepreneurial career began in 1985 when he co-founded America Online, also known as AOL. Under Steve's leadership, AOL became the world's largest and most valuable internet company, helping to drive the worldwide adoption of a medium that has transformed business and society. AOL was the first internet company to go public, and in 2000, Steve negotiated the largest merger in business history, bringing together AOL and Time Warner in a transaction valued at $350 billion. To facilitate the merger, Steve agreed to step down as CEO when the merger closed. Following the departure from AOL, Steve founded Revolution, a DC-based investment firm with 3 funds that support the startup lifecycle at every stage while focusing on backing companies based outside of Silicon Valley. We started off our conversation by learning about Steve's upbringing.
I was born and raised in Hawaii, which is a little unusual. Both my parents were born and raised in Hawaii, so our family goes back more than 100 years. When I was born, actually, Hawaii was not yet a state. It became a state on my first birthday in 1959. So that was kind of an interesting place to grow up. Obviously, a little unusual because it's an island and the weather is basically the same, kind of year round. My mom was a teacher, my dad was a lawyer, and they both passed away recently in the last few years. But both were sort of lifetime Hawaii residents, other than going to the mainland for college, and then for my dad for law school. And so that's where I grew up.
Awesome. I know we're going to get into this after, but I just can't help myself but think, like, as soon as we started this interview, it was like a flashback to, like, I don't know, 20 years ago, just being on AIM. Like, yeah. I just want to get that out of the way because, it's just crazy. And now I'm like, God, everyone's just getting older because some people that listen to this podcast might not even know what AIM was.
Totally. So, I understand that. And also AOL, some people know it well. A lot of people, maybe vaguely heard of it, but
my mom, I'm sure, and my mom listens to this podcast. Her email is still at AOL.com.
Nice.
She is.
Well, thanks to your mom out there for the loyalty.
She's hanging on. Yeah. No Gmail in that on that phone. Anyways, but that, interesting life in Hawaii. How long were you there?
Until I went to college. So 17, I moved to Massachusetts, went to college there, and then worked in Ohio for a couple of years for Procter & Gamble. And then worked in Kansas for about a year for the division of PepsiCo Pizza Hut, where I was the director of new pizza development, which is a pretty cool title when you're 23, 24 years old. And then moved to the Washington, D.C. area, Northern Virginia, in 1983. So I was about 25, I guess.
Yeah.
And joined a startup, which a few months later failed. So that was kind of my first experience in the startup world. Welcome to the NFL. But thankfully, 2 of the people I met there, Jim Kimsey and Mark Sterup, and I ended up co-founding America Online AOL in 1985. So a little bit of a journey from Hawaii to college to Ohio to Kansas to Virginia, but eventually was able to kind of get going starting AOL.
Yeah, back in Hawaii when you were a kid, as far back as you can remember, what kind of things were you into? Like, what were your interests? What did you like to spend your time doing?
Well, I was pretty entrepreneurial at, a relatively young age, 9, 10, 11. I had a lot of little businesses, did paper routes, sold cable television door to door, had other kinds of things. I was, ran a record store, a bunch of different things. None of them were particularly successful, but I enjoyed them. And I think I learned a lot from each of them. I also, when I was in high school, was really interested in music business. Thought that's what I'd go into. So would be reviewing concerts and even promoting some concerts. So I continued some of that in college. I also was, when I was in high school, interested in journalism. Thought maybe that would be the path. It was the era before your time of Watergate with Gordon Bernstein as some of these famous kind of reporters who kind of broke the scoop. I thought that was kind of interesting. So I was doing a bunch of different things, but I think the part that was most interesting to me was the starting new businesses side. Something about the creativity of starting things was I found attractive.
On that note, though, sometimes I guess people fall into entrepreneurship in different ways, right? Like sometimes it might be your parents that are entrepreneurs, and you kind of get that firsthand exposure, or it could be someone in your family, or it could be someone completely outside of your network, but you're just sort of inspired by them. You see what they've created. Was that ever the case for you? Like, did you look up to somebody that maybe had started their own business where you're like, oh, wow, this is possible? Or did you just sort of naturally just fall into something where you're like, I'm making things and I'm making money, so life's good. I just want to keep doing this.
Well, in the early years, again, 10, 11, I didn't really know what I was doing, didn't know what an entrepreneur was, but I knew I liked starting these different things. It didn't really come from my parents because they were had somewhat more, traditional backgrounds, as I mentioned, lawyer and teacher, so that was not particularly entrepreneurial. I do remember when I was growing up, particularly in my high school years, looking up to and reading a lot about entrepreneurs that were building things. I remember Ted Turner, for example, building Turner and CNN and so forth. I found really interesting, and many others. This was in the early '70s kind of time frame, and so that was part of it. And then when I was in college, things sort of locked in a little bit more. I really decided I wanted to help build the internet. At the time, it didn't really exist. It was still more of a concept. The government had funded some defense agency, DARPA, to build it, but it was still only available to educational institutions, government agencies, not to consumers or businesses. But I was reading about these things. Again, this is late '70s, but in France, something called Minitel. In the UK, something called Prestel. There were some interactive TV trials in Ohio. Just things were bubbling. I found that interesting. And then I read this book in 1980 by Alvin Toffler, the futurist. Also wrote Future Shock and some other books. But the book that really mesmerized me was The Third Wave, which he said the first wave was the agricultural revolution. The second wave was the sort of the industrial revolution. The third wave was going to be this technology revolution, this digital revolution, basically predicting more than 4 decades ago the internet that we all know today. And that really got my attention. I thought, I want to do that. I want to be part of building that. But when I graduated in 1980, there really weren't internet companies to go to, so it still was more conceptual. And certainly back then, venture capitalists weren't backing 21-year-old kids with crazy ideas. And that's why I went into sort of the corporate sector for a few years to get experience at both Procter & Gamble and PepsiCo. But even when I was at both those companies, I knew what I wanted to do. I just didn't know how to get there.
So, Steve, I saw that you went to Williams College, which, in Massachusetts, I know it's probably the number one liberal arts school today. How did you make that decision? I saw you studied political science. Doesn't have much to do with the internet, obviously, or anything technology related. I was a political science major myself. Why did you decide to go that route? And did you get turned off by it, by all these kind of like extracurricular reading you were doing and all the future technologies that kind of excited you?
Well, in terms of why Williams, I knew I wanted to go to some school in the mainland, broaden my horizons versus Hawaii, and thought going to the East Coast probably would be better. And Williams actually had a connection to the school I went to. It happened to be a school called Punahou in Hawaii. Actually, they couple 3 people from Punahou go to Williams every year. It's just been true for a bunch of years. So
That's what
there was a little
Barack
bit of a
Obama Barack
Barack
Obama.
Obama was a classmate of mine in high school. I was a senior when he was a freshman. He ended up going to Occidental and then Columbia.
See that
But
now that's his claim to fame. Like
yeah,
he
well,
would have won a third term if he had just mentioned that.
well, I do remember the first time I actually remember a little bit in high school. I don't think we had classes together because it was a 3 year difference. But I do remember playing basketball with him a couple of times. And then when he moved to D.C. as a senator, the first few months he was a senator, we got together and I saw some event. And he said, "Well, you're like the most famous person who's graduated from Punahou." I said, "Well, I think that's going to change." And sure enough, a few years later, he's president of the United States. So that was the end of that little discussion. But I'm super proud of what he did, and obviously how he went from Hawaii to kind of leading the country.
You mentioned these like early jobs you had kind of in your early career, P&G, PepsiCo, Pizza Hut. What were some of like your biggest takeaways working in marketing at these companies at the time that maybe you still use today, like in your career?
Well, first of all, I didn't quite finish the earlier question in terms of at college, I was the kind of student that was doing what I needed to do reasonably well, but my real passions were outside of the classroom, including some of the side businesses I was doing, concert promotion and other kinds of things. And actually, the only course I took that really was computer related was, I think it's called Computer 101 or something like that. And this was the era in the late 70s of punch cards, where you create a program and it'd be on these punch cards, and you'd wait a couple hours for it to get processed. And of course, for me, find out it didn't really work and have to do it all over again. So that experience with computers was pretty frustrating. Like, well, this needs to be easier, and maybe that helped push me to make AOL easier. But I do remember that experience. In terms of I did learn a lot at these companies. Procter and Gamble was and still is a great marketing company. Really good at understanding what consumers want in terms of doing consumer research. Really good at getting people to try their new products. When they launch something, they provide free samples, which is something we later did with AOL and a free trial disc. So I think that was important. But the reason that I was only there a couple of years, then went to Pizza Hut, is Procter and Gamble was a classic kind of top-down command and control environment where a lot of the big decisions are made at the top. Pizza Hut, because it really was led by franchisees, was really more of a bottoms-up kind of company where a lot of the innovation was happening at the periphery. So I thought both were important experiences, understanding how to think strategically and from a P&G perspective, new market opportunities, research, and so forth, but also the fact that while we did try to do innovation at the corporate headquarters of Pizza Hut, most of the really good ideas came from one of these entrepreneurial franchisees somewhere else. I think that was also helpful to me in those early days, just better understanding business broadly and product development and marketing more specifically.
Mm-hmm. Do you like pizza now? Like after working at Pizza Hut, I'm just curious.
I do like pizza. There were probably a few years where I maybe liked a little bit less, but and I must say it was a crazy job because although I spent some time at our headquarters in Wichita, Kansas, I did travel around a good bit because part of our insight is I think we had 5,000 Pizza Huts at the time, but there was something like 50,000 independent, pizzerias all around the country. So we said, well, somebody somewhere probably has an interesting idea we can learn from. And so I would travel around and try to discover what the next big thing would be. And so I can't believe it. 23, they were paying me to fly around the country and eat pizza, but that was my job.
What was the craziest pizza formula you came across in new development?
Well, again, I was only there a year. The big focus there was actually starting to which now, of course, taken for granted, but at the time it had not yet happened. The delivery of pizza was one of the big initiatives that we were pushing on. It was just emerging. Some competitors were starting to do it, like Domino's, but it was still kind of early days. So that was one of the big areas of focus.
There's something that you brought up, and I know it is also a part of kind of what you're doing now in terms of traveling and kind of going around. And it was something that I was actually thinking about recently, and even during COVID, the lack of travel, right? Not for pleasure, but for business, right? Meeting people, seeing them face to face, getting that, I don't know, that physical human to human connection, and how today we almost try to find ways to say, hey, why don't we jump on, even if you're, in LA or you're in DC or with somebody not too far away, can we just jump on a Zoom? Can we just hop on a call versus, hey, let's go out to meet, or, you know what? Oh, you're in Virginia, I'm in DC. I'll drive to you. I'll fly to you. How much of an impact do you think the travel, the business travel specifically that you did, has had an impact on your career? Not only your life, I'm sure it's had an impact on your life, but on your business career.
So I think it's been very important. And I obviously see the benefit of the internet and email and instant messaging, and more recently, the broad-based adoption of video conferencing, particularly Zoom, particularly during the pandemic. And it is convenient. I was talking to a colleague of mine who flew from DC to LA to speak at a conference for an hour or so, and flew back. And it was like, well, I kind of killed 2 days to show up for some event that was half in person and half hybrid. And so we're kind of adjusting to that and recognizing some things like this discussion can be done just as effectively with video conferencing technology. But there is value to being together. There is value in bouncing ideas off each other. And I do think traveling around the country, whether it be living for a while in Ohio or then living for a while in Kansas, and particularly with the pizza job, spending a lot of time on the road, traveling around different cities. I mean, entrepreneurs basically, kind of bump into people and ideas. They tend to see a problem and see it as an opportunity and say they're going to go do something about it. And the more you're out and about, the more people you meet, the broader your network, the more places you visit, the more likely you're going to bump into some of those people and ideas that could change your thinking and maybe open up opportunities. And it's certainly part of what we've been doing over the last decade with Rise to the Rest, trying to find entrepreneurs all across the country, not just in the usual tech hubs like a Silicon Valley, but all across the country. We've now invested in companies in over 100 different cities. Visiting those cities, understanding what strengths those cities have, and what industries that legacy industries can leverage in terms of new opportunities. It's one thing to read a report sitting at your desk in your office. It's another thing to be out there and actually seeing things firsthand and meeting people, and having that kind of more, kind of one-on-one kind of experience. So I think both are important, and I think we're all trying to adjust to this new reality. What are the things that really make sense to do more in person? What are the things that can be done more virtually, more digitally? But I'm still a believer, just based on my experience, that a lot of great ideas came from being at some conference and talking to somebody off on the side, or visiting some company and seeing something off on the side. And it wasn't on the agenda. It wasn't something that would have been discussed if it had been like a Zoom. And that led to insights that ended up, being quite helpful.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated by that moment when someone, maybe it's not a moment, but like that time when someone comes across an idea that's so, good that they can't help but like execute on it and like take that leap of faith, I guess, to become an entrepreneur. And for you, like when you're kind of in this early career in marketing, working at these big companies, as someone who was interested in starting businesses at a young age and did start businesses at a young age, was there a moment or time when you felt like, I think it's time for me to maybe start my own thing, or kind of go work at a startup, or like what was going through your mind at the time working at these bigger companies, when deep down maybe you wanted to become an entrepreneur, if that was the case?
Well, as I said, when I was in college, I knew I wanted to be part of getting the world online. I knew I wanted to be part of sort of the internet revolution. So that was clear. I just had a sense it was going to be a big opportunity and an interesting kind of challenge. It just took me a number of years, really about 5 or 6 years, before I could really do it, before I could really kind of co-found America Online. And so that journey was a little bit circuitous. And on the way, I was trying to pick up some knowledge. Exactly, going back to some of your questions, I went to Procter & Gamble Parks. I did know they were a great marketing company, and I would learn some things about marketing from them. I went to Pizza Hut in part because it was more of a decentralized, distributed approach to innovation, and I thought that would be interesting. I joined the startup when I first moved to the DC area, Northern Virginia. There was a great entrepreneur who I think had a really interesting idea. The market turned out not to be there, and that's why the company kind of ended up failing. But I thought I'd learn something, even if the company was successful, great. But if it wasn't successful, I'd still learn some things that would end up being helpful. So it was. I knew I kind of had a sense of where I wanted to land. It just took me a little while. It was a little bit of a circuitous path before I finally got there. And in retrospect, I do think the experience I had at some of those larger companies and the experience I had at the startup, even though it failed, were super helpful.
Right. So talk to us about quantum computer services. How did you end up there, and what did the company do? I know that's kind of where AOL that AOL journey started. So share with us a little bit about that.
Well, it goes back to the startup that failed, which was a company that was doing a product called GameLine, which was essentially a communications modem for video games. And back in the early 1980s, very few people had personal computers at home, but a lot of people had Atari game machines. And so the idea was almost like a Netflix for video games. You paid a monthly subscription fee, and you could download these video games and kind of play them over the phone line at the time, and play them for a flat monthly subscription fee. Seemed like a really good idea. Unfortunately, by the time the product actually came to market, the Atari video game market had kind of imploded. And so we were sitting there, which is why had to go through layoffs and so forth. But the two co-founders and I said, well, let's take some of these ideas and start a new company that's focused on personal computers. But instead of trying to do it on our own, let's do it via partnerships. And so Quantum Computer Services was that company. Essentially, was building what we now think of as sort of private label or white label online services. We built something called Q-Link for the Commodore 64 home computer, which at the time was the number one home computer. We built something called PC-Link for IBM. We built something called, for Tandy. We built something called Promenade for IBM. We built something called Apple Link Personal Edition for Apple. And that really was the first 5 years, is essentially these private label services. Then what happened is our deal with Apple kind of blew up. We had agreed to license their brand name. They'd never done that before with another company. They regretted it once we launched, because we had control of their brand and we're doing things like free trials of software, and they like to sell software and the Apple authorized stores. So there was a lot of tension, and ultimately said we want to tear up this contract and go our own separate ways, which was sort of a kind of a difficult time. A lot of people in the company, probably a lot of our investors, thought it would be the end of the company. But we had to walk away from having the Apple brand name, and that we had to name it something else. And so we had a little internal contest, and that ended up being America Online. So Apple Inc. became America Online, and we started focusing on building that up. And from that crisis, it was kind of a near-death experience. It actually ended up unlocking a big opportunity that then fueled our growth. So the Quantum Computer Services was essentially the name when the company started. We renamed the company about 5 years into it to America Online.
But what sort of ended up happening while you were there? Perhaps I'm sure it was after you started AOL, when you guys kind of started getting into the social, like you were a pioneer of like social networking and being able to connect with one another online. I mean, from what I can remember, whether it was AIM or even before that, just the instant messaging, the ability to get onto the internet and just talk to someone, I don't know, halfway across the world, was something that had never been seen before. And so what happened in the world of computing that ultimately ended up becoming the vision for AOL sort of to move in that direction?
Well, from the early days, even that first service we launched in the fall of 1985, that was our focus, what we now think of as social media. We thought of it more at the time as community. And we said the killer app of the internet is people interacting with each other. So our whole focus was on building things like one thing we called People Connection, that was sort of like chat rooms. And we launched instant messaging, which then kind of evolved to texting and added buddy lists and had message boards. And the whole time I was running AOL, until we did the merger with Time Warner, about half of our traffic was these community functions. So we did that because we thought that was powerful as an idea. We also did that because that was a way to differentiate versus some of the competitors at the time. Companies like CompuServe was focused on content. Another one called Prodigy, backed by Sears, was focused on commerce. We said we got to differentiate by focusing on community. So that was part of the differentiation. We also, at the time, it was super expensive to be online. It cost $5 or $10 an hour to be connected, which is why only 3% of people were online when we started, and they were on average using the internet for an hour a week. So it was really, really early days. We said we got to make this a lot more affordable. We've got to make it a lot more easier to use. Got to make it more useful. We got to make it more fun, and that helped drive it as well as the partnership strategy I mentioned. So I think in retrospect, the things that really helped propel the early success of AOL was the focus on community, was the focus on easy to use, useful, fun, and affordable, and was the focus on building partnerships that could accelerate our growth, do a lot more together than we could do on our own.
Steve, at the time, how many people in the country actually had computers? Like, now that's a crazy question to ask, because everybody has like 3 of them. But at the time, what was Because this is like early 90s or late 80s at this point.
No, this was mid '80s when we
Mid
started,
80s,
1985.
yeah.
I think it was about 10%, 10 or 15% had computers, but more importantly, only about a third of the people who had computers had communications capability.
Right.
This is kind of crazy, but it took us several years to convince the PC manufacturers to build a modem into the computer because very few people were actually getting online. Most people were buying a computer to do spreadsheets or word processing or something else. And the computer companies, IBM, Apple, et cetera, said, why would we add a modem to every computer, add the cost of a modem to every computer? And most people aren't really using that. And so at the time, it was viewed as a peripheral device. You'd go to a computer store and the peripheral section of the computer store to buy a modem to connect your computer to other computers into the internet. And so it took us a little while to really get traction and convince people that the main reason people would buy computers would be for communications capabilities. And as we got, which it probably was in the year maybe 1989, something like that, maybe 1990, we started getting some of the PC manufacturers to build modems in. That's when we suddenly saw an acceleration because instead of a minority of computers having modems, all of the computers had modems. And we also got, as part of these partnerships, got those computer companies to essentially bundle the AOL software on the computer. So you turned on the computer, plugged it into the phone line, and clicked on our icon, and you're up and running. And that's really what drove a lot of our growth.
Did you have like a grand vision at that time of what you wanted America Online to be?
We wanted to be the on-ramp to the internet for the masses. We're not going for the niche markets. We were really trying to build mainstream support, and so we were going for average people, not computer hobbyists or computer experts. I used to say at the time that we want to make it so easy to use that my mom can use it. My mom was a little offended by that. She said, well, why don't you pick on, I'm better at this than your dad. Why don't you pick on your dad? But it made the point that we really were trying to make it super simple to get started, super simple to navigate. We were the first to come out with a graphical user interface to make it easier to navigate. A lot of services before us were text-based. So everything was tuned to what can we do? What more can we do to make it easy to use? Even adding voices to it. People talked about the welcome message or you've got mail, things like that. It was just a way to make it friendly, accessible, not so threatening. So anything we could do to drive down the price, anything we could do to increase the utility, different services, anything we could do to make it friendly or more accessible. Those are key areas of our focus.
It seems like these days, I'm sure you would agree that technology is just like changing at a rapid rate, right? Like we're just every day something new's coming out with this AI thing, and then so many things are happening right on a daily basis. Did it feel like that back then too, in those days when people were starting to get online and start using the internet? Like, was it? I'm sure it was an exciting time, but did it feel like it was this fast moving thing that you were sort of trying to be obviously you're at the forefront of it, but trying to like constantly see like what's around the corner?
No, it was really slow. It was kind of like molasses.
Yeah.
The first decade was really a struggle. Most people did not think that normal people would ever have a need to get on the internet. And it seems crazy now, but for the late 80s and the early 90s, that was the case. I'll give you a statistic to prove the point. As you said, we started the company in 1985. We went public in 1992. It was the first internet company to go public. We'd been at it for 7 years. After 7 years, we had less than 200,000 customers. It was still pretty nichey. And then 7 years later, we had 25 million customers. So it went, the first phase was very, very slow, very hard, and kind of a struggle just to sometimes stay alive. But in the mid 90s, the internet went from nobody knows about it or cares about it to suddenly it was the hot thing. Everybody wanted to be connected. And we were well positioned at that time and benefited from a lot of that growth in the mid to late, kind of 1990s. So in that phase, in the late 90s, it was a boom time. It's sort of this .com boom. Any company with a .com address was able to get funding, and some went public even if they didn't have any revenue. And it was sort of a gold rush frenzy period. But the first decade was very slow, and it really required kind of perseverance to stick it through until finally the sun started shining.
And it sounds like you had to make this sort of pivot from B2B to like direct to consumer B2C with like kind of the rebrand and everything. Is that the
Well,
case?
we were always focused on consumers, but we were using these PC manufacturers as partners to market to consumers. So we would create a service that was a consumer-oriented service where there was a monthly subscription fee to be on the service, but relying largely on the Commodores, the Apples, the IBMs, people like that to include that software and a free trial with their computers, with their modems. So we were able to leverage their large marketing spending to fuel our growth. But we always were focused on consumers.
Yep. And the business model was software sales, like
No,
selling.
the business model was we would give our software for free, but we would basically get people on a subscription where they'd pay a monthly fee initially, including a certain number of hours of use. Down the road, it was more a monthly fee for unlimited use. And so we did not sell software. We basically created software that we then gave away free as a trial device, a little bit like razor and razor blade. We're kind of giving away the razor to be able to sell the blade. So our initial model really was a monthly fee where people would use a whole variety of services, and we would make money on that. Over time, we cut the cost dramatically, and we had to then supplement with advertising. And so the second decade was the advertising side became more important, which allowed us to essentially cut the price of access and reach more people.
Steve, as a leader during this time of growing this company, how difficult was it to recruit talent to work for you and to see your vision at such an early time for the internet, for technology in general? And were there people that were qualified to build this vision that you and your co-founders had? I mean, clearly they were because they built it, but how long did it take for you to be able to get to that level?
Well, it took a while. It took we were as a young company, and most people didn't know what we're doing, and it seemed kind of risky to most people. So getting people to leave large companies to join a fledgling startup was hard. I think it also was harder that we were in Northern Virginia, not in California or Massachusetts or one of the bigger tech hubs, and it was harder to get a talent, harder to raise capital, harder to generate attention, which I think helped fuel some of my passion and interest in the Rise of the Rest and trying to help entrepreneurs outside of those tech subs, kind of start and scale their companies. What was helpful, though, is one of the three co-founders I mentioned, Mark Serif, did have a technology background and was one of the pioneers in building the core technologies of the internet. In terms of when it was originally a DARPA defense project. And so he was able to assemble a team that was quite sophisticated in terms of understanding the technology, which helped on building that core technology. I was able to provide some of the perspective on the marketing side, establish some of the partnerships. And the third co-founder, Jim Kimsey, was about 20 years older. He had some experience with businesses and was able to raise the capital to kind of get us going. So, in retrospect, all three of us had very complementary skills, and the company would not have been successful without all three of us. I could bring a certain perspective about marketing, but first you needed the product and the core technology built, and you also needed the money to really launch the product. And so it was a good partnership in that sense.
This episode is brought to you by More Than Profit. If you enjoy the Founder Hour, we think you'll enjoy this podcast too. It celebrates entrepreneurs, investors, and leaders that are living and working with purpose. The host, Bryce Butler, sits down with his guests and shares personal stories about what it's like to succeed and even fail. But more than that, what motivates them beyond just profit to press forward in their work and as a leader. Check out More Than Profit wherever you get your podcasts or at www.morethanprofit.fm. This episode is brought to you by Jason Wu Beauty, affordable luxury makeup infused with skincare ingredients. Founded on the idea that beauty should be effortless and chic, Jason Wu Beauty is about really showing yourself through the beauty products, not being covered up by them. Whether you prefer minimal, natural elegance or bold glamour, Jason Wu Beauty has the perfect products for you. With colors and shades that can be used with any skin tone, you can create countless looks to enhance your natural beauty and release your inner icon. You will feel beautiful, confident, and completely yourself. Jason Wu Beauty is clean and always cruelty-free. Available now at Target, JCPenney, Shoppers Drug Mart, and jasonwubeauty.com. That's JASONWU beauty.com. All right, let's get back into the episode. What would you say was like the most pivotal moment while you're at AOL?
There were several. That moment when Apple canceled the deal, and we had to rebrand it as America Online was one. I think when we went public and started to see that the internet was coming at an age, that was another which was hard, but it was, I think, pivotal. And I think 1996 or so, maybe 1997, we slashed the price of access, and of course, as you expect, the usage suddenly soared. But we weren't able to keep up with it, and so at one point, our AOL was down for like 23 hours, and nobody could connect to it. It was sort of this, national crisis. It led the news on all three of the TV networks for the main headline, and most of the newspapers, which was crazy because even just 5 years before, nobody knew what we were doing or cared about what we're doing. And suddenly, the fact that we're down for a day was this national crisis. That to me was, well, frustrating, obviously, that we let our customers down, but sort of wow, I guess the internet really has come of age. I guess this is something that's now important.
Yeah. You mentioned the merger with Time Warner, and I know you've gotten a lot of questions about this, but I'm just sort of curious, like what led to you wanting to do that at the time, and I know you said that it was I think you believe it's like it was right for the time, but if you had to go back, would you still have done it? Would you have changed anything?
Yeah, the reason to do it was strategically. AOL, this goes back to 1999 when we were conceiving of the merger. It was announced in 2000. AOL was a leader in what was then known as dial-up narrowband, but we didn't really have a path to higher speed broadband. And Time Warner owned a lot of assets, but also owned the largest cable company with the broadest broadband footprint. So strategically, it was very valuable. And also financially, we had gone from 70 million market cap when we went public in 1992 to $160 billion 7 years later. It's actually the fastest growing stock, best performing stock of the decade. And so merging with a much larger business with a much more diversified, kind of set of businesses was important. And we were able to get a majority of the ownership of the company as a result. So that all made sense both strategically and financially. Indeed, it made so much sense, in my opinion, that as part of the deal, I agreed to step aside as CEO. And say, well, please put these companies together. You guys can run it. I just believe in the vision of this combined company. What ended up happening, which is why it ended up failing and ultimately being broken up, is even though the strategy was, I think, compelling, the vision was compelling, the execution of the vision was flawed. And that ultimately came down to people and priorities and culture and things like that. And that was, when I think about the merger, think about the famous Thomas Edison quote from over a century ago: vision without execution is hallucination. Mm-hmm. Having a good idea is important. It's the starting point. Executing against that idea is where the rubber really meets the road, and that's where we really failed in terms of the merger.
Was it because of how large the company was, like Time Warner at the time, that it was really hard to focus on this one segment of it and really execute it like how maybe a scrappier, smaller company would?
I think that was some of it. I think AOL, when we started, was 20 or 30 people. When we went public, was about 200 people. By the time we merged, was, I think, 7,000 or 8,000 people. And then we merged with Time Warner that had 80,000 people. And so it was a much larger company with all kinds of different businesses that in theory could be quite strategic and quite synergistic, but in practice were operated more autonomously, almost like independent divisions, independent silos. And so that contributed to the challenges of really seizing the opportunities that two companies together had.
Steve, how did you feel like really during this time? Like, you've built this company, this is all kind of unraveling. What is Steve feeling? Like, give me
Terrible.
the non-bullshit response,
No, terrible. No, I really believed in the idea. It was a little hard, as you'd expect. When you're a founder and build a company, it kind of do feel like it's your baby, and handing that baby over to somebody else in terms of a merger and saying you can raise my child now. It always is a little bit emotional, but I was comfortable with that because I really did believe strategically it was important. But once, a year or two into it, it was clear that we weren't really capitalizing on the opportunity. There were a lot of, frustration on all sides. And so it was really frustrating and disappointing. And I'd go to, board meetings, for, a couple of years or so. And I didn't look forward to them. I don't think they looked forward to seeing me. We were, kind of on different, pages in terms of what the priorities should be. which is why I stepped down, not too long after about 3 or 4 years after the merger closed, and just said it's time to move on. That's when I started making investments in entrepreneurs, and then launched Revolution as an investment firm, and then a few years later launched Rise of the Rest to particularly back entrepreneurs in other places, and said, rather than start another company, I'm going to start a firm that can help others start and scale companies.
Mm-hmm.
And rather than just focus on, like most people do, on the tech hubs like Silicon Valley, I'm going to focus on the rest of the country.
I really believe that people, whether it's in business or in life, they really need to make mistakes on their own, or, learn lessons on their own, and not just learn from books or from mentors or whatnot. And at times, I mean, it's very easy to just say, yeah, you know what, I listened to my mentor and I'm not going to do this or that, or I'm going to do this or that. And then maybe regretting doing something or not doing something. So having known what you know today, being an investor, a mentor, I'm sure, a leader with all these other companies that you're now working with, had you told Steve Case at the time what to do we take this deal or not? Do we get acquired or not? What would you have done differently?
Well, when we were looking at it, first of all, even though the Time Warner business was, I think, 5 or 6 times larger than the AOL business, our market value was double Time Warner. So we actually effectively acquired them, and our shareholders owned a majority of the combined company. The reason we positioned it as even despite that, as a merger of equals. And then, as I said, I shifted the CEO responsibility to them. When we were talking about this, including talking about it with our board, there was concern about some of these issues in terms of the scale of this company. Could you drive the synergies across the company? But I just believe, turned out to be incorrectly, that the opportunity with the internet was so vast, and Time Warner really needed to lean into the future and be much more relevant in the digital businesses. And we, as I mentioned, at AOL, needed to be better positioned in the broadband side. That the promise of the two companies would be such that people would see the future and work together to seize the future. And that turned out to not be the case. I still think strategically it made sense. I think most of the board members who I've talked to over the years still think strategically it made sense. But it goes back to this execution point. It doesn't matter if it strategically made more sense if you're not able to get the right people focused on the right priorities, working together in the right way to drive the execution side.
How was your, as during your time at AOL, what was your personal life, your wellness life? Like, what was that like? I mean, being the leader of this multi-billion-dollar, huge growth, tech company, how are you taking care of yourself outside of, work? Because I feel like a lot of times, we talk to these founders and leaders, and, you're always focused on either the successes or the failures in the business, but the personal life and everything outside of work ties absolutely, like, both positively and negatively to work and to career. So what was that like for you?
Oh, it was hard. I enjoyed it because I felt like I was building this new medium. I felt like we were changing the world. I felt like it was an interesting time to be alive, a time to be at the epicenter of that. So in some ways that was very gratifying, but it also was exhausting. I had to, travel around, literally in the country, and then start traveling around the world as we're launching new joint ventures. And so I was always on the move. Had a young family, 3 young kids, and was not able to spend as much time with them as I'd like. Went through in that mid-90s time frame a divorce. So obviously there was some damage on the family front. So I think it's very hard, as you say. That is true with most people, certainly in the entrepreneurial world, but also people in other sectors who are kind of leaning into a particular opportunity and really working more hours than they should, and making sacrifices in terms of other things they could or should be doing. And so, no question, it was a struggle.
Is there a way to balance that, or is it just one or the other? Are you picking between? I mean, and not just for you. I'm just talking in general with now all the companies that you work with and the people that you have to advise. I mean, do you have to choose? Because Pat and I have been doing this for 5.5 almost years now, going on 6 years at the end of this year, and it almost feels like every story we hear of an ultimate success story, has to do with somebody choosing between personal life and work, or health and work, or personal health and work, or health and personal life, right? Whatever it may be. Is there a balance, honestly?
Well, I think I'm a little older, a little wiser now, and so I'd say part of that is sort of setting your goals. Sometimes, maybe you could be more moderate in terms of your expectations of growth, and that's one way to manage it. If you really want to go for it, and given the nature of the internet at the time, it did seem like the right thing was to go for it. Then the question is, how can you build a team? How can you delegate as much as possible so it takes a lot of the burden off you? I tried to do that. We hired a lot of great people as part of that, and I went from in the early days of being an entrepreneur to kind of being involved in everything to later on trying to essentially be involved in nothing. I had this view that if I was really a great CEO, I'd set really clear, strategic direction, really hire a great team, provide clarity regarding what they should focus on, empower them, and to be successful. And so if I was really great, I'd wake up in the morning, had nothing to do. So it was kind of a complete change in terms of the mentality. That said, just given the nature of the issues and being a public company and launching around the world and being one of the fastest growing and most visible companies in the world at the time, it did require me to be front and center. It did require me to be traveling, kind of quite a bit. And so I think some of this is recognizing there's a certain cadence of thing, a certain chapter. You see this also here, where I am in Washington, D.C. There's some people who end up going into government, like working at the White House for 2 years or 4 years, and for that time, there's really not a lot of balance. They're kind of all in because they have significant responsibilities. You can't do it for that long, but they're all in for that particular period and do make sacrifices. It's harder if instead of it being 2 years or 4 years, it's 10 or 20 or 30 years. That's where you really need to make sure you've got more balance. And to me, a lot of that is the priorities you set and the team you put in place.
That's great advice. Yeah.
You mentioned starting Revolution after stepping down at AOL on basically the premise or the thesis that investing in entrepreneurs outside of Silicon Valley, and obviously Silicon Valley has changed a lot since then, and these days we see a lot more founders in other areas. But throughout the years, I mean, what was it? How do you see Silicon Valley as a part of the larger like tech ecosystem, and how has that kind of guided you in the direction that you've taken?
Well, I think Silicon Valley is awesome. It's awesome. It is no question the most vibrant startup ecosystem in the world, and it's sort of the pride of America and the envy of the world. And so it's great. Obviously, there's always going to be challenges, but Silicon Valley is not just a place. It's also like an idea. And how do we take that idea of thinking in kind of breakthrough, disruptive ways? How do you reimagine important aspects of our lives? How do you really shift how big industries work? How do you take that mindset and create that environment in more parts of the country? And also, how do you create more opportunity in more parts of the country? One of the problems in the last a decade, which led to a rise of the rest, was that 75% of venture capital was going to just 3 states: California, New York, and Massachusetts. So if you wanted to start a company, you felt like you had to be in one of those places. So a lot of people left Ohio or Virginia or Michigan or other parts of the country to go to a place like Silicon Valley because that was the land of opportunity. So that kind of hollowed out some of those communities and kind of advantaged even further Silicon Valley. And so we've seen a brain drain over the past couple of decades. And how do you slow the brain drain of people leaving? And how do you create a boomerang of people returning? And venture capital is part of that. Creating vibrant startup ecosystems in dozens of cities all across the country is part of that. And helping these companies when they do have ideas to scale them and establish the right partnerships and get the right visibility is part of that. We're trying to create a more inclusive innovation economy. So anybody anywhere has an idea, has a shot at starting a company, a shot at really the American dream, not just a few people in a few places.
So what do? You decide, you're starting this firm. Do you go out on a, fundraising tour and you hit up old friends and say, hey, this is what I want to do. This is the premise, this is the thesis, come along for the ride? How did that, what were the early stages of?
It evolved. In the early years, I was just investing my own capital, and then we started to see some success and said, let's expand this and build a larger team, and let's open it up to outside investors. And at Revolution, we have what's called the Rise the Rest Seed Fund. We also have Revolution Ventures and all later stage Revolution Growth, and we have different groups of investors in each of those. But for the Ride the Rest seed fund, it's really is individual investors who are successful entrepreneurs and people like Jeff Bezos and Howard Schultz and Tory Burch and Eric Schmidt and a lot of folks like that, Ray Dalio, who are all investors with us in backing these entrepreneurs in other places. But it's not a charity thing. Our goal is to generate top quartile returns by identifying promising entrepreneurs in places where most venture capitalists aren't looking, investing in them, helping them in a variety of different ways scale their companies. So ultimately ends up being a great investment return for everybody, and that will then inspire more people, including some of the coastal venture capital, to be investing in the different parts of the country as opposed to just in their own backyard.
Right. You talk a lot about and write about technology in the future. I'm curious, like, what you are most excited about in terms of technology seeing in the next, let's call it 5, 10, 20 years.
Well, a couple of thoughts. First of all, I mentioned earlier I was inspired when I was in college by this book by Alvin Toffler called The Third Wave. I wrote a book also called The Third Wave 5 or 6 years ago. And the way I framed it is the first wave, it's all about the internet. The first wave is getting everybody online. We've talked about that from the early days of AOL and how we and other companies essentially built the on-ramps to the internet and got everybody online. That then led to the second wave, the last couple of decades, which is building apps, software on top of the internet, Facebook, Google, things like that, which obviously been really interesting. I think the third wave is when the internet meets the real world. And that's where the internet starts really reimagining healthcare and food and agriculture and a lot of other education, a lot of other sectors, which we've seen a little of in the last couple of decades, but we're going to see a lot more of in the next couple of decades. So that's the big industries that I think are up for grabs. And one of the things I've learned is that some of the things we talked about before, that partnerships are critical to really have major, systemic change in these industries. So we work with the companies we back on helping them form partnerships. And we've also learned that because these tend to be regulated sectors, you've got to understand the policy aspect to it. So those are the big themes we're looking at. And then there are a lot of technologies that are bubbling, and each of these industries usually integrate a lot of technologies to really enable the change they want. But I think it's important, just as in the early days of AOL and the internet, not to focus just on the technology, but focus on the applications of the technology. Right. And so that's really how we're focused. A company like Clear, for example, which most people think of as when you're going through an airport, you can get it faster because Clear has created this fast path. The underlying technology, the biometric technology, is interesting, but the way they've deployed that in terms of a business model, subscription service, and partnerships with airports and partnerships with airlines is what turns that technology into something that's really useful.
Yeah. It's funny. It's interesting, actually, that the firm is called Revolution, and some of these industries that you mentioned, like education, healthcare, these deep, industries that have to fundamentally change in the future for it to sustain. I think it's going to require a revolution, right? And it seems like technology is sort of a catalyst for that. But how far out do you think we are from, let's say, taking education as an example, right? Like, we have these historic institutions, we have this fundamental way of doing things. We have the Department of Education, which is the government, which kind of controls a lot of it, right? And we all know that. How do you see, and how far out do you think we are from technology and the private sector and startups really, getting to a point where we're starting to see significant change quickly? Because I know we're seeing it little by little, but college is still a thing, and people are still going to college, and who knows when that's not going to be a thing as much as it used to be.
Yeah, there's obviously been a lot of investment in education technology, but I agree with you. We're kind of in the second inning in terms of a revolution in education, would be K-12 or higher ed or lifelong learning. There's some examples of things that are really quite interesting. Last week, we hosted a Rise the Rest CEO retreat. It happened to be in Phoenix, Arizona. And one of the partnerships we formed is with ASU, Arizona State University. Michael Crow, the president there, has really done a lot of innovative things. It's now the largest university in the country, the fastest growing university in the country, and 8 years running the most innovative university in the country. They've gone from 20,000 students to nearly 200,000 students, and half online, half on campus, and doing some really fascinating things. So we need more examples of that, more models like that really can be taken to scale. And some of it, you're seeing new technologies. The one that's gotten a lot of attention in the last couple of months, ChatGPT, could be super helpful in terms of education. Some schools are banning ChatGPT. Other schools, including ASU, are embracing it, saying it's a new tool. How do we teach people to use this tool in a constructive way?
Yeah. I'm curious. I think people oftentimes are afraid, when it comes to technology that, and think of it as if it's going to be a complete substitute to something, right? Like if we're talking about education, technology is going to completely disrupt it, and there's going to be a completely new alternative to going to college. But oftentimes we don't think about the complementary aspects of technology when it comes to like existing institutions, existing, firms or companies where that could help them innovate and make it more accessible, for example, or cheaper or whatnot. I'm curious, like where you kind of stand as a technologist yourself. Like, do you see technology generally being more of like a complementary thing to humans, and or is it kind of situational? Does it kind of really depend on the industry?
I think it depends on the industry, but generally, I would agree with that. The technology in the early days, people, kind of are excited by what's possible, also a little fearful about what's possible, and often there's a concern also about some of these new technologies, AI, robotics, things like that, will destroy jobs, and sometimes it does eliminate some jobs. But also, when we've seen these technologies over the past, century, really, they also often create jobs, including some that we've never imagined before. And so it's always a balancing act. But I think the main point is you can't really stop and shouldn't try to stop the progress of innovation, the progress of technologies. How do you deploy it in ways that can improve people's lives, improve societies, continue from a U.S. perspective, continue to maintain the U.S.'s lead in the world as the most innovative entrepreneurial nation in the world, but just recognize there are risks associated with these things, and the internet itself, social media, which as we talked about, played a role in. It's been generally very positive, but there's also been some negative unintended consequences. You just have to be candid about that, authentic about that, and say, how do we maximize the positives that these technologies can enable, but also recognize there are going to be some downsides, some risk, and be thoughtful about dealing with those.
Steve, I've got to ask because it has something to do with kind of your background in college and political science, and also what you're doing now, which is investing in these companies that will ideally better and change, the world for the better. Um, but a lot of them, and we've talked to several folks in healthcare and education, some of the things that you mentioned are systemic problems that are really going to require, unfortunately, government to step up and say we've got to change this, right? With if it's insurance with healthcare, and I mean education is just a complete mess. So I don't even know how to frame that problem. But have you ever had an interest in being in government? I mean, I just think about your story, your background in political science, what you're working on, what the country needs. I mean, why not do some of those things also through government and politics and
Well,
policy?
I think government's actually quite important. I understand why entrepreneurs say, "Oh, government, they're going to screw things up, they're going to slow things down." But my own experience with the internet, that wouldn't exist without the government funding the defense agency, DARPA, to create the internet. Wouldn't have existed unless the government decided to break up Ma Bell, AT&T, to create competition in the phone business. There's a bunch of decisions that were made to essentially create and then open up and commercialize the internet. And a lot of things that we've worked on more recently in other sectors, there is an important role for government. So I'm not as negative on government. I agree with you. If you're really going to change these big aspects of our lives, these big industries, it's going to require a cross sector approach, and government has to be at the table. I have been working on the policy side of things really from the early days, because when AOL was started, it was still, believe it or not, illegal for businesses or consumers to be connected to the internet. It was restricted to government agencies and educational institutions. We had to get Congress to pass legislation to commercialize the internet, to open it up to everybody. And a lot of other things we had to do in those early days. In the last couple of decades, I've worked on policy, including co-chaired something called the National Advisory Council on Innovation and Entrepreneurship, chaired a White House initiative for President Obama called Startup America. So I've been involved a lot on policy and continue to be. I'm working now with the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, on a national entrepreneurship strategy. So I'm happy to work on policy. I think it is important. What I try to stay out of is politics, because I think one of the challenges in policy is how hyper partisan everything has gotten. So I try to avoid that and focus on what the right political or policy solution is, and then how to bring both parties together to get bipartisan support for that, including the Jobs Act I worked on 10 years ago, some of the legislation that passed last summer, including the Chips and Science Act with regional hubs. I I worked on that. I've been working for the last decade on immigration reform. Even today, published an op-ed in CNN about immigration reform. So I think policy is important. Government is important. For me, the best way to do it is to be in the private sector, trying to champion and back these entrepreneurs, travel around the country, see what's happening everywhere, and try to influence policy while staying out of politics.
So are you like completely opposed to running for office? I mean, because I think like a case closed, just kind of campaign slogan would be awesome.
Well, I'm not sure that's a winning slogan, just for the record. But no, what I'm doing, I feel like I'm having an impact and able to do it without kind of getting kind of caught up in the political crosshairs.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Steve, thank you so much for sharing your story with us and just spending time talking about your story, but also answering questions that I'm sure our listeners will have had and have already about your story and your thoughts on the future and what you've built and policy, and it just frames everything really well in terms of your career, right? Of starting off in Hawaii, moving to the States, going from being a poli-sci major to starting a tech company and then investing all these entrepreneurs. You were able to just pivot all the time and kind of change what you were doing because you believed in the future and the future of not only the country, but of technology, of innovation. And I think that it's an inspirational story to both of us and to everybody who's listening. So we thank you for that, and can't wait to see all the other companies that you invest in and all the other impact that you have throughout your career.
Well, you're kind, and thank you both for doing this podcast, inviting me on, but also using it as a way to tell the stories of entrepreneurs and hopefully inspire the next generation of entrepreneurs. And for those out there listening to this, you probably have some idea in your head, some problem you think you have a solution to, but maybe haven't really been kind of quite able to take the leap. I would just encourage you to not a better time than now. Things are changing rapidly in a bunch of different industries. And also it ties in with our work with Rise the Rest. If you're somewhere in the middle of the country and you feel like you're not in Silicon Valley, therefore you don't really have the ability to kind of play in the NFL, you feel like you just don't have a chance. That's not true. It might have been true 10 or 20 years ago. It was really hard, getting a little bit easier. 1,400 new venture firms have started in Rise of the Rest cities in the last decade. So capital is available locally. If you have that idea, take a shot, jump into the fray. It'll be challenging for sure. It may not work out, but if you have an idea and you don't take a shot at it, you'll likely regret that later. So those listening who are on the thinking they want to be entrepreneurs, I would just say no better time than now. We have big problems in the world that need bold entrepreneurial solutions. And because of what's happening with Rise the Rest all across the country, every city now is launching really innovative companies that have the potential to change the world. Also, kind of in some ways, kind of strengthen their communities. So go for it, jump in.
Absolutely.
I love that.
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.